Welcome everyone to the Director's Seminar at the Institute for Global Prosperity at University College London. I'm Professor Henrietta Moore and I'm the founder and director of the IGP. I'm delighted to have you with us today, and in particular because I am looking forward enormously to this discussion on Indigenous environmental history and its relevance to future prosperity. And I'd like to welcome joining us today is Professor Joy Porter. Professor Porter is an interdisciplinary scholar of Indigenous history with research interests in the environment, war, modernity, and human cultural expression. Underlying and uniting her work is a core interest in Indigenous pasts and presents, particularly the ways in which Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous histories have informed and continue to inform relationships between Britain and North America. She is principal investigator within the Treated Spaces Research Group at the University of Hull, which manages a very large portfolio of external research grants and brings together Indigenous groups, museums, creative artists, NGOs, policymakers, and academics to foreground treaties and environmental concerns in present-day policy debates. She's currently a primary investigator of the AHRC-funded project, Brightening the Covenant Chain, revealing cultures of diplomacy between the Crown and the Iroquois Confederacy. She also works closely with the University of Hull's Energy and Environment Institute and the Wilberforce Institute for Slavery and Emancipation. Professor Porter undertakes a range of knowledge exchange work and activities on decolonization, working with business schools, textbook publishers, and examination boards. And as a commentator, she makes regular appearances on TV and radio and contributes to culture debates. And she's a regular contributor to History Today, to the BBC World Service, to the BBC Radio, and to other social media and press organizations. And her research interests include environmental studies, heritage, decolonization, and Indigenous data curation. And Joy, we are delighted that you're with us at the IGP today. And could we just go right into everything and let me offer you the floor, please?
Thank you so much. And I should say at the outset that I'm not Indigenous, I'm Irish, very much Irish. And yeah, well, the Irish, of course, were colonized and colonizers. So that's one of the, although my work is very much intertwined with the Indigenous world, I am not Indigenous myself. I'll just make that clear. Okay, well, you might be thinking, what has the Indigenous world got to do with global prosperity? And I think that's a reasonable question. After all, there's at least 5,000 culturally distinct societies and communities that are designated Indigenous in over 90 countries. And they're only 5% of the world's population. So let's say between 370 to 500 million people. But they are 15% of the world's poor, and their life expectancy is up to 20 years lower than that of non-Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous people and prosperity don't naturally come to mind. Recent data from the International Labour Organization, I'll just adjust that, showed that disproportionate numbers of Indigenous people live on less than $1.90 a day, about 18.2% versus 6.8% of the non-Indigenous world. So if we could go to the next slide, it'll help me make the point that there's a little map of the Indigenous world roughly to give you that idea of distribution. And if we go to the next slide after that, Indigenous women are consistently at the bottom of all the social and economic indicators. Over 3 billion people in the world now live rurally, and Indigenous women tend to have less access to land and resources. Only 14% of agricultural landowners globally are women. But as I'll be making clear, Indigenous female leadership is also on the rise, and we're living in the midst of a very positive upsurge in governance led by Indigenous women. So Latin America and the Caribbean, they've got the highest proportion of Indigenous and tribal people, but they are 30% of the extreme poor. You see the same trend in Asia and the Pacific, a region with 335 million Indigenous people, and some 7% of the total population are Indigenous, but they're nearly 16% of the extreme poor, again, in Asia and the Pacific. Same trend again in rich North America, where there's over 7 million Indigenous people, 2% of the population roughly, but they constitute 3.5% of the very poorest in society. So if we could have the next slide, please. On one level, this is ironic, given that historically it's been Indigenous resource wealth that's helped power the rise of empires. Now, we can't explain global wealth distribution today simply by pointing at the historical extraction of resources from Indigenous lands, but you could say that colonialism has certainly shaped modern inequality in heterogeneous but fundamental ways. Somehow, and it's an enormous debate as to exactly how this has happened, although Europe is only 8% of the planet's landmass, between 1492, for the sake of argument, and 1914, the outbreak of the First World War, Europeans colonized over 80% of the entire world. Now, the loss suffered by Indigenous people is impossible to quantify, but there are a few basic stats that are really useful to keep in mind. It's thought, for example, that in just one 150-year period, Europeans extracted up to 200 tons of gold from the Americas. And if you think about your life today, so much of your life, what you eat, some of the things you do, are testimony to that exchange. So potatoes, tomatoes, gum, chocolate, vanilla, corn, aspects of medicine, certain ideas of governance. It's a very long list and a completely different talk. But from a world environmental perspective, whilst the colonial legacy is vitally important, it's really the use and misuse of Indigenous resources during, in my opinion, what's known as the Great Acceleration from 1950 that's especially worth focusing on and thinking about. The Great Acceleration is the post-1950 period of phenomenal growth in the socioeconomic global system, arguably the start of the Anthropocene. And that's the period when man's relationship to nature really transformed. And since that point, most of the growth in population has been in the non-OECD countries, the club of rich countries, but the world's economy and consumption has been mostly within OECD countries. And as we know well, there's been this enormous growth in acute inequality. And this graph shows you how there's a turning point in 1950 for all these socioeconomic and Earth system trends. So these undesirable environmental indicators that start to really grow at the same time as we go into space as a species. And all of it's a symptom of our success as a species that uses resources in a non-circular way in order to grow. And it's got to be admitted that greatly accelerating how we stress the planet has allowed a turbo boosting of world population to occur. So between 1950 and say 2019, the number of people on Earth has risen from 2.5 billion to 7.7 billion. By 2100, it's predicted there'll be maybe 10.9 or more billion. But by then, world population growth will stop. But since 1950, it's clear that many of us are wealthier by conventional indicators than ever before, although over 1 billion people are still living in absolute poverty, and so many of them are indigenous. There's another thing worth bearing in mind that maybe people don't talk about enough when we look at ourselves as a species inhabiting the globe, and that's that as a species, we're getting on a bit, we're aging collectively. 2018 was the first point in history when there were more 65-year-olds or over in the world compared to children under 5. And by 2050, it's predicted there'll be twice as many 65-year-olds or over as there are children under 5 in the world as a whole. And this too is a function of our species' success. The fact that we produce 1.5 times more staple foods than we did 50 years ago, and that we use 4 times as much energy and have made all these significant advances in medicine and technology, that's what's allowed us to grow the average life expectancy in most nations above that 65 years level. It's phenomenal to think that babies born in 2019 are expected to live, barring nuclear debacle, until a remarkable 72.6 years old, and those born in 2050 to live until they are 77.1. A big factor that's allowed this great acceleration is the degrading of natural resources that we need to sustain agricultural production, and our modern food systems that tend to concentrate power and wealth in the hands of just a few major corporations. So there's been a plus in terms of overall numbers of the species, but also this inequality issue is being exacerbated. Even though yields have massively increased, so has population. We still have rising food insecurity. 820 million people are still hungry, 2 billion food insecure. And it's interesting to think that war in Ukraine, which a place that produces so much food, will only exacerbate inflation in the cost of food and world hunger. And that's, again, if we avoid nuclear cascade. On that front, actually, it's worth bearing in mind that we live in a world that was significantly rearming prior to this latest global threat in Ukraine. So the overall picture, I suppose, from an environmental and species point of view, is that the world is grappling with a number of widespread and indeterminate risks created by ourselves. I would argue probably the most fundamental is the risk to our natural producers, the ecosystem services in economic terms, the bugs and the bees, the things that create the cycles of life and allow the hydro system to work. And this stress is directly connected to human consumption levels and overall numbers. According to the World Wildlife Fund, since 1970, there's been a 68% decline in birds, amphibians, mammals, reptiles, and fish. And it's thought we're living through a 6th mass extinction on Earth, with a quarter of all species about to disappear in the next few decades, many of them. Ulrich Beck talked about this a while ago. We talked about a risk society with globally shared, widespread, indeterminate risks that we ourselves created. Now, it's interesting to me, as someone who's thought about Indigenous issues for a while, that the intellectual response to all of this, especially in terms of conservation and development thinking, has taken the shape it has. There's been this acknowledgement that we're now facing wicked problems, interlinked problems, where the solution itself often can change the fundamental nature of the problem in the first place. And also there's been a recognition in recent years of what David Kennedy of Harvard called the dark side of virtue, a recognition that when we try and solve these problems, our power through inequality, our version of humanitarianism carries with it certain ideological norms. And these in themselves bring their own problems. So there's been a move to try and find some kind of consensualization, some kind of set of strategies or framework that are more participatory and location specific and holistic, and that could bring cooperation and knowledge sharing to protect global public goods. That seems to be a fundamental, I think it's an offshoot of complexity theory, really, but it's a way of looking at these wicked problems that have been created by how we have overconsumed, essentially. Now, after all that, how does the indigenous world fit into all of this? How do indigenous peoples, how do they figure in the solution sets to complexity and wickedness and resource competition? Well, the big stat that's put forward by the World Economic Forum and others is that indigenous peoples have a key role to play because they own, occupy, or use a quarter of the world's surface area and safeguard 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. And thoughtful people like with the wildlife scientist Eric Dinerstein of Resolve, he's argued that if we were to address indigenous land claims and uphold existing land tenure rights, and if we were to respect indigenous managed lands, we could achieve biodiversity objectives on about 1/3 of the global safety net. And that's the first comprehensive estimate of the total land area that we need to protect in order to, well, save the world, essentially. Currently, we have a safety net of about 15%, but arguably we need more like over 50% of the world protected. Oxfam also produced a report in 2016 that found that 2.5 billion people actually depend on indigenous land, and over 50% of the land on the planet overall is claimed by customary land users who are often local or indigenous people. However, we only recognize about 10% of it legally. These are lands mostly in Brazil, Australia, Canada, Mexico, and China. And you can see that some of the big institutions, in particular the World Bank, really started a process of changing the role that indigenous people were perceived to play in all our futures. I think around about 1982, when they started really showing an awareness that development as it was then constituted had the potential to harm as well as help indigenous populations. And you begin to see this language of inclusive growth rising in prominence from then. For some indigenous people, this is curious because most indigenous people are urban rather than living in the conceptualization that a lot of conservation and development studies work suggests, that they're linked fundamentally with land. Also, the biggest truth about the indigenous world is that it's profoundly diverse. It's an infinity of nations, to use one phrase from a recent book. And yet the way that the indigenous world is discussed in these global contexts is as being fairly uniform and undifferentiated. But in saying that, it's good, I think, that indigenous peoples are perceived as being capable of helping the world address these wicked problems. Now, this is an interesting slide, I think, because on the left, you've got how I think the major global thinkers perceive how the indigenous world should work to help us solve wicked problems. And you can see there's 3 circles, and then there's the solution set at the interstice of the 3 circles. So you have traditional knowledge from Indigenous people in the pink circle, then you have academic knowledge from conventional sources of scholarly thinking, and then you have policy in the lower circle. And it's thought that when these three overlap, voila, you have solutions arrived at. I think that's a nice idea, but I'm not sure that it's actually been proven to happen beyond in the theoretical realm. The solutions that I myself perceive as being fundamental from the Indigenous world that really I think we need to think more about are on the right. And I think they resolve for me around various strategies to do with making a long-term transition in environmental stress and adapting to rapid environmental change. This is Indigenous people have been at the forefront of climate change for much longer than most of us. Also, many Indigenous communities have developed strategies for dealing with trauma of various sorts, and in particular, what's called eco-trauma, which many of us haven't really grappled with yet, I don't think. But you might think to yourself when you were young, if you're roughly my age, you might think, well, I remember lots of flies having to be cleared from the car windshield, and they're not there anymore. No one cleans flies from their car. That is symptomatic of loss of the natural world in our lives. And really, unless you're the type of person who counts birdsong, it's hard to realize that probably most of us will experience some form of eco-trauma going forward. Okay, sorry, if we could just go back for 1 second, please, to that slide, thanks. Also, I think the big benefit from the Indigenous world is encouraging us to think in terms of deep time, to expand our horizon of expectation for change, and to think more in terms not of 4-year political terms, for example, but in terms of multiple generations ahead, what the Haudenosaunee call the unborn faces, the children yet to be born, to be thinking policy in those terms. And then there's the big message that comes across from many governance traditions and Indigenous lifeways, which is a fundamental focus on balance, finding balance in everything, from population numbers, within kinship relationships, within nations as understood, and thinking in terms of relationality and reciprocity. These are fundamental principles. Other big principle is thinking not so much of the self, but of one's community and of who one represents. And I kind of did that when we started this lecture. I said, I'm Irish, this is who I represent, as it were. And you find a lot of Indigenous people don't speak as Fred blogs, let's say. They speak of Fred blogs of such and such a clan, and they see their position as very much embedded in community. And land cannot be parsed separately from that sense of self. Another thing Indigenous world, I think, can give us is a sense of economics, and I'm aware that this entity that I'm speaking for now has done a lot to move us away from GDP as the primary indicator of well-being. Indigenous traditions have talked about this forever and talked about the difference between increase in growth, particularly the increase in connection, increase in well-being, increase in relation, rather than increase simply in what we own or can possess. And this is all tied up with the final thing, which is Indigenous governance systems, which stress fundamentally diversity, inclusion, consensus, and respect for nation-to-nation relationships embodied in treaties, which are a fundamental intercultural device that we share and Indigenous communities themselves share. These are some of the things I think are most useful for us when we consider solution sets that may be offered from the Indigenous world. I think the Indigenous world will be at the crunch point for some of the world's biggest ethical decisions in the 21st century. And I think that impetus that you see from elite institutions to return land stewardship to Indigenous peoples is extremely positive. And I also think it's wonderful that we're moving to reinstate sustainable Indigenous food systems. But I also think we should bear in mind that there's been a long history of protected lands and parks forcibly removing Indigenous people. Look, for example, at the Ogiek, who were evicted very recently, 2018, from Mount Elgin in Kenya. Another issue is the move by conservationists to help Indigenous people gain land title is really in conflict with the United Nations REDD+ program, which many Indigenous people have protested extremely strongly against. So what's called new conservation, which talks about Indigenous peoples as partners, and it's very community-based, and there's a lot of talk of free and informed consent, which is obviously a wonderful value. However, there are many paradoxes, not least the partnership between some of the new conservation work and the world's largest mining and fossil fuel companies. For example, the US Foundation Conservation International, supported by Chevron, has found itself tarnished by Chevron's multi-billion-dollar lawsuit with Indigenous groups in Ecuador over oil spills that the company actually inherited when it merged with Texaco. And then there's the Amazon Chernobyl. There's about 70 ongoing cases in 31 countries against Chevron. It's also got to be said that there's a conflict when conservationists conflate biodiversity improvement with meeting economic needs of Indigenous people. Not every Indigenous group or person is necessarily going to want to make biodiversity solutions their life's primary objective. There is diversity, I can't repeat enough times, in the Indigenous world. So you find, for example, a formal complaint with the OECD against the World Wildlife Fund for its alleged links to abuse of the Baka Indigenous people in Cameroon, and the claim that protected areas were set up without Baka consent. Now, overall, the biggest criticisms surround the claim that big conservation groups tend to choose tourism, industry, and corporations over Indigenous people. And let's not forget the number of environmental and land activists who wind up dead protesting in order to protect Indigenous lands. NGO Global Witness numbered at least 1,024 such activists killed between 2002 and 2014. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I think it would be really useful for us to think when we're conjuring with all of this about the tsunami of change that I think is round the corner for us all. And for me, the 5, or is there 6 there, 5 big areas of enormous change that I perceive surround these areas. One is everything bound up with the idea of the 4th industrial revolution, and this moment that world history is in, where machines and us, our corporal selves, are beginning to do what the World Economic Forum calls dance. We're starting to bring the machines that bit closer to ourselves and into our private spaces. And if Xuan would just show that little video for a moment, I think it sums up this future that's very soon to come to us all. Are you able to do that, Xuan? Thank you. This is Amica, an AI-informed robot. How intercultural and ameliorative she is. So this enormous change is coming. So is fundamental changes in gene editing, as I say, robotics, artificial intelligence that's going to keep feeding back to us what it perceives we want at speeds that are unprecedented. Then there's nanotechnology, this new virtual world or metaverse. And then there's the digital economic frameworks that are being developed. All of this is happening at the same time as unprecedented global inequality, pressures on resources, and as I've said, population pressures of various sorts to do with aging and overall numbers, the climate problems, and then of course, war, which is with us already, and we don't know how or whether it will be limited. And then increasingly, we have pollution and environmental issues being exported into space because the near-Earth orbit is now becoming very littered and controlled by nation states and corporate interests. And we're becoming an ever more censored, in the sense of having many sensors, world where satellites are able to measure more and more of what's happening on Earth. If we could have the next slide, please. And this is an enormous tsunami of change coming in the next few decades. And what do we have to fight it with? What do Indigenous peoples have to fight it with? How can they survive? How can we all navigate it together and collectively? I would argue that really we have to cling to the centrality of international law and of a rules-based system. For Indigenous people, they really have to keep pressing to be defined as peoples in an international legal sense. They have to keep pressing to be able to exert collective and not just individual rights. And they have to keep developing these ideas in the global north of self-determination and in the global south of human rights. And those two things can be in tension, but international law, however defined, is really all we have if we are to protect and defend our own future, and with it, that of Indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. Now, as I say, our image of the Indigenous world tends to be, especially if we're working in conservation, a kind of peasant version, but not this version. I don't know if anyone out there knows who this is, but it's Deb Haaland, who's the current Secretary of the Interior, one of the most powerful people on earth, full stop, also Indigenous from the Laguna Pueblo. So I think we're going to see more of this, more of Indigenous female leadership, and more of Indigenous people having to reckon with them, not in a subaltern position, but as increasingly part of the solution set to wider global issues. So next slide. And finally, I just want to finish by asking us to think, using the lens of the Indigenous world, a little bit more about what prosperity is. I would argue that prosperity is a highly culturally specific idea. You can see here from this definition, it's Old French, it's Latin, it's from this idea of hope and finding one's hopes realized. I'd also like to argue that prosperity is very specific to place and context. I think we're on sure transnational ground when we think about what it's not. We know that prosperity is not war. Peace and prosperity go together. And we know prosperity is not illness. Health and prosperity go together. And we know it's got something to do with abundance, things that we value. The question is, what do we value? And in this fourth industrial revolution world where we're able to do so much more, the questions really will be not so much can we do things, whether it's gene-edit plants and animals or create synthetic biology animals that don't exist at all in nature. The question will really be not so much can we do amazing things, but should we? So I'm arguing really that prosperity, as I was thinking about it, it's in itself a wicked idea. It's so embedded in other concepts that you can't really disaggregate it from them. And really, the issue that is the problem is not so much prosperity, but its distribution. And here I'm echoing Amartya Sen's comments on famine, that it's really a question of balance. It's a question of ethics. It's a question of political and ethical choices about who eats and who doesn't, who lives and dies, how much we think about what the Haudenosaunee call the unborn faces, how much we think about the generations to come. Prosperity isn't really an economic question or a technological question. It's an ethical question, I think. If we can have the next slide, please. It's also worth thinking that there's a bigger picture to thinking about prosperity. The big picture good news is that since the 90s, total global inequality has declined for the first time since the 1820s. There's less income inequality between countries, but inequality within countries has risen. According to the UN, since 1990, income inequality has increased in most developed countries and in some middle income countries, including China and India. But, and these graphs are quite interesting because they show where we are in terms of the social mobility, that's the graph on the right, and then overall Gini coefficient, how unequal we are. And we can see that the UK and China aren't that far apart here. China is also thinking hard about prosperity, and it's really top of their current agenda. They have this policy called Common Prosperity, Gongtong Fuyu is my best rendition of it. And there's an awareness that there's a need to get beyond wages and to start giving people more access to the larger parts of the pie, capital ownership, reduce private debt. And it's a move to get equity distributed amongst China's 200 million middle class. So China, just like the UK, is thinking about leveling up opportunities and about trying to make a giving back culture somehow in the midst of what those graphs show, acute inequality. China's Gini coefficient is large, close to 0.5. China's trying to learn from history, if you look at it positively, trying to avoid some of the negatives of late capitalism, its lack of limits and the collapse of the middle class, which China looks at America and perceives to be happening. China wants to achieve a Confucian dream of great unity or little health or moderate prosperity. And they're not really trying to steal from the rich. It's not old style communism or crackdowns. It's more to do with corporate social responsibility and a collective philanthropy from a pie that China is very much determined to see grow. And perhaps concerningly, this is all happening at the same time as China is moving towards a centrally highly controllable digital bank currency, a central bank currency. So it's what I'm trying to say really here is that Indigenous ideas of balance and reciprocity aren't that weird, and that globally we're all thinking about how to bring balance, and whether it's the South American idea of buen vivir, well-being and bringing people together rather than just prioritizing economic goals and bringing nature into the story, or whether you think in terms of Hozo as the Navajo do, or Silla, the super concept in Inuit culture. You're really talking about an emphasis that's transnational, recognizing that there are points in history it's worth thinking about sufficiency rather than growth, and about growing connections rather than further concentrating wealth in the hands of a few. Now you'll notice that one of the things I haven't talked about, because it's really another discussion, and I think it's really key to prosperity, is the spiritual dimension. And maybe the IGP has had someone on here talking about that already. But I think that idea of how the spiritual reality gels with the economic and the natural world is a fundamental question. So we could have our last slide, I think it is, please. I just want to show this picture of Jeff Bezos. I don't know if you can see him. He's very much dressed as the Western hero with a cowboy hat on as he boldly goes into the new frontier. And at the time when he and a number of other key individuals who had accrued enormous wealth were using it to go into space, he acknowledged that it was his employees that had allowed it to happen. And he justified it by saying that the historical justification, he said that like aviation, like flying airplanes, what he was doing was simply the same thing, like Wilbur and Overwright, for example. That's how he saw it. But I think that the inequality that we're seeing when we have key individuals like these controlling the near Earth orbit and the world beyond our globe, this is a non-trivial historical moment. And I think that it deserves strong analysis because it is true. This is a quote from one of my favorite generals. He said that he who controls the moon controls the earth. And the beginning of a colonizing of near Earth by key private interests is a very interesting echo of some prior moments in history. And I think it's going to be fundamental going forward. And it is linked essentially to inequality and how we understand balance in terms of wealth and income on this earth. I think it deserves much more attention than maybe it has achieved so far, cross-disciplinary attention, that is. Thank you. That's the end of my talk.
Thank you very much. And before we get into questions from the audience, let's just talk a little bit about prosperity, which is one of the reasons that we've been talking about a whole series of things in the IGP to do with the kind of the notion of prosperity itself and where it comes from. So part of our job is about redefining prosperity for the 21st century. And that's very largely about who gets to do that job. So who gets to define it? Who gets to redefine it? Where are those conversations going on? How are they how are they brought in? So one of the questions that we've been thinking about in the IGP is that all notions of the good life are place specific, they're diverse, yeah. And I think that there can be no one single notion of prosperity, and that's quite a difficult idea to work with effectively, because actually it requires, on the one hand, a kind of critique of what has been macroeconomic policy and its goals, and on the other hand, a kind of decolonization of the notion of development, of the notion of progress, and therefore of the notion of prosperity itself, as you kind of implied. So, you know, prosperity, if we're not careful, like the notion of development, will turn out to be yet another Western concept, which is self-defining itself in a kind of conversation that it's having with itself. So I was very interested in what you were saying about the ethics of that and how we might drive that kind of critique within the IGP and sort of decolonizing critique, but also in a way that we can also think about how do we drive a global conversation around what you called, I think, the inequality, how to address the relationship between inequality, balance, and income, because this is a really quite, you know, a really difficult issue. And to make sure that, because, you know, in the work, a lot of the work we do in the IGP is about criticizing previous notions of development and progress, and saying that, you know, one of the ideas is if we've all got one idea of what prosperity is, that implies that all societies are moving in the same way, which is completely not the case. But I mean, so what were your thoughts about how to address this question of making a critique without actually in the end turning out to have created another concept which is itself exclusionary?
Language is the answer, really, I think, because at the same time as we've been reducing the number of species on Earth, we've been reducing the number of languages on Earth. Yeah. And the reason I put that slide up that took us back to prosperity's Latin and French roots was to make that point that when you speak in a language, you're carrying with you an enormous sack of concepts, ideas, and histories. And one of the things that I do a lot in my working life is embarrass myself rotten by trying to learn hello and goodbye in Ojibwe, Seneca, whatever language I'm trying to talk to another nation in. I try and pick up a word, and even just with picking up hello and goodbye. And bear in mind, I'm Irish. I come from a linguistic tradition that doesn't have a yes and a no in the same valency. So you don't say yes and no in quite the same way. There's more gray, I suppose. So every time you pick up a word, that's why I said Ozo or in Navajo or I use the Inuit concept, because the word for prosperity and the gap in translation is where the limits of your thinking lie. So, for example, in most Indigenous traditions, you cannot have prosperity if you have poverty. You cannot have prosperity if your spiritual world is not parsed fundamentally with prosperity. You cannot compartmentalize these aspects of life. So the words for prosperity, the fact that they don't translate, is in itself instructive. Does that make any sense to you?
Well, I think there's a question about the cultural baggage of any word. I mean, including, say, a word like human, which is a very problematic word, or a word like individual. But I think that when you're talking about redefining the prosperity for the 21st century, you're deliberately trying to create some kind of divergence from what has been the standard story about what is the purpose, what is an economy for. So you're, instead of saying that an economy is, that life is in the service of the economy, economy has to be in the service of life. I mean, that's a very straightforward way in which we express it in the IGP. So there is a divergence there, but the question is, with all of these kinds of critiques, which are both, academic and connected to social movements and activism, and also connected to policy and to how to deal with systemic discrimination and injustice, and whether how the future is going to look different. The question is, who gets to define them? Now, at the very local level, we've got a way of doing that in the IGP, which is that we work in collaboration only with the communities. And so that means that those definitions of prosperity are the definitions which are developed locally and through those forms of collaboration. But there could be, and certainly plenty of my colleagues think there are, I mean, they'll probably come on in a minute in the call, and some of the students also, to say that there's a grave danger in that you're actually just reinforcing another kind of notion of prosperity, which is not one that has been developed sufficiently through taking account of diversity. In other words, because the way diversity is used, particularly, and this is something you mentioned in your talk, in these contexts, is to make it something that then has to be part of the solution to the problem. And I think that's very complicated. In other words, that systemic discrimination ends up by saying, okay, so there are these alternative ways. So these alternative ways have to be the solution to the problem. And I think it's a very fine line to track between how you do one and how you do the other. And we've spent a lot of time discussing it in the IGP anyway.
This is, I think, where ethics and spirituality come in.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that prosperity and spirituality historically have been strongly tied. In fact, didn't President Trump, isn't he part of a prosperity church? There's a big American, sorry? Yeah,
there are prosperity churches, yes, all around the globe.
There's a big American tradition where prosperity is the spirit is the material reward for spiritual value, and if you grow spiritually, then you have the reward. And that there's been a very certain Protestant branch in the United States that has reinforced that. So I do think that if you haven't already, I would definitely be thinking about this question of spirituality and ethics, because as you say, it all comes down to who has voice and who has the power to decide whose voice counts. So if I were to say to you that prosperity really is something that depends on your spiritual wealth, that would be fundamentally alien to most Western people's way nowadays of understanding what is abundance. And what happens when you meet systems that are not congruent, when you can't get consilience between definitions?
Well, it may be that there are none, but I think leaving aside the Christian tradition for a moment, because that is, after all, anyway, a dominant tradition. So, but the question is, you can have diversity in understandings of prosperity, but you're still dealing with a pretty large world system, which is pursuing one set of goals. So being committed to redesigning prosperity for the 21st century is, of course, an ethical project. But the question is, how does that project itself get shaped, and what is it shaped by? So I think the way that I would think about it is in relation to the kind of writing that you get in the sort of the IPBES reports. on conservation and biodiversity and Indigenous groups. So one way in which you quite often see it formulated in those spaces is precisely to say that there are many Indigenous nations around the world who are in areas which are responsible for a very large percentage. I think you gave the figure 80% of the world's biodiversity or something. The figure is very, very large. And in that, there is a kind of implied thought that somehow we are going to come to some solution around biodiversity problems by making all of the people who live in those areas do the heavy lifting. Right?
Yeah,
They're going to come with a solution to this problem. And we've created this mess, right?
Yes.
But you know, so, and in that kind of situation, that's because of the way in which this whole system is working. That's not that's not a collaborative conversation. That's
and can I just
conversation about that.
That you could plot a graph over deep time of the Western world constantly doing that. You may have remembered in the 1990s, there was Dances with Wolves, that movie, and there was an upswing of looking to the Indigenous world. Same thing happened in the 20s, and there was a whole look to the Indigenous world to solve the problems of modernity. You can see points of this happening. It's a regular thing, and often led by elites.
Yes, that's the point. That's the point. And so that, you know, I think the critical leadership from Indigenous peoples and nations is very strong on this point. I mean, why should they be doing the heavy lifting for the system that is itself, you know, just replicating itself through repositioning? And I think that's a very difficult issue. But in terms of the IGP, I think the more important thing is how to keep a critical perspective working on the notion of prosperity, whilst also redesigning it in a way that works to drive some change, some transformative change in the system we currently have. Because the system we currently have is still talking about GDP.
But increasingly, you are causing change. There is talk of the happiness index. There are talks of other metrics. I mean, we talked about when you appeared before the UK government, and their answer to you, in essence, to a very well thought out and complex intellectual point was, yeah, well, we have these statistics anyway from the Office of Statistics, and we can cherry pick whatever stats we like. But your point was a much different one, which was we're prioritizing GDP, and if we keep doing that, we will keep getting the same systemic problems enlarging through time. And as I say, it's an ethical and political question.
Well, there's been a very interesting set of discussions about buen vivir, for example. So that's an area that we've done quite a lot of thinking about in the IGP, and that. So this is, you know, what's important about buen vivir in a way was the emergence into the domain of the political, what could be deemed to be politics, of sentient beings, of nature, of the rights of nature. This was a huge step forward. But then, of course, at the same time, there's been plenty of criticism by Indigenous groups and Indigenous nations of the fact that that did not stop the government from carrying on giving mining concessions and, you know, doing business as usual and pursuing various forms of economic growth. So there can be a kind of schizophrenia around these things, can't there? Which, you know, it looks like you try to get, in a sense, a certain recognition for having done a certain set of actions, but actually so that you can carry on doing what you were doing before.
I'm glad you said that rather than me, because, you know, if you go on the net, that is often said, isn't it? That that Indigenous people are used as tokens for corporate structures to feel better about business as usual, keeping doing business as usual. But I suppose the question is, how do we anticipate that change happens?
Well, that's what I was really talking to you about, is how does one drive change? You know, I mean, in the sense that how to get a conversation going, a global conversation going around these issues without that conversation being fatally compromised by the existing inequalities that already exist. And you have to find a way.
It interests me that if you Google prosperity, it tends to be the right who's doing the thinking on it. It's, you know, the Hoover Institution has a big research thing. There's the Legatum body, and maybe the center, and even the center right, needs to be doing more thinking and joining in this debate more. So there is more.
Well, I think they probably are in the debate, but I think they're not being heard, partly because the media is representing those other voices, and I think that's a problem. So, you know, in this debate around biodiversity, land rights, what's happened, the way in which extractive value has positioned certain people's livelihoods and bodies as being disposable and others as not, for example. Although there is a certain amount of discussion around these issues, the debate itself is not driven from that positionality. It's driven from the positionality of those who are not Indigenous peoples or Indigenous nations, somehow taking some cognizance of that position, or appearing to take cognizance of that position. But actually, there's the inequality there in voice is still apparent. So it's a bit like people talking now about, yes, we know there's a problem with GDP, but it's still the best we have. Yeah. So the right continues to say that. There's actually been relatively little movement on that, although there's a whole environmental history behind the alternative and the conceptual history, but it doesn't have much traction in reality, I think.
Yeah. But I do think that there's a long-term tendency for both left and right to see Indigenous people as a mirror of their own concerns.
Yeah.
So, for example, I have a student working on a mine in Alaska called Pebble Mine, and it's literally an enormous gold mine. So 500 billion pounds worth of gold, and the metals that allow conversations like this that go in technology and missiles and so on, and silver and so on. And there's Indigenous people who have vested interests, but there's also the people of Alaska. There's also salmon fishing, spawning grounds there. And you look at Pebble Mine and you think the long-term pressure there for even Indigenous communities to say, yeah, exploit it. I mean, what would you or I do if we were sitting on literally a gold mine? I mean, the left's assumption is that somehow all Indigenous people are going to sacrifice their kids going to college, having sanitation, running water, and so on, and broadband in order to fight the good fight for the environment. But as you started by saying, that is maybe putting too much on communities that have suffered systemic disadvantage for generations.
Yeah, and especially because the voices that are being heard are very partial. And then actually the question of whether they're being listened to properly is another matter. But let's open up then to the audience. So we have, because we've got lots of different perspectives coming in from different angles. So before I come to the first question that's actually up on the board in front of me, anyway, let's go to the second, which is about, which is an anonymous question. It's just saying, could you talk about consent and ethics when working with Indigenous communities? How does that work, the sort of the consent and ethics part of it?
Well, there's various Indigenous ethics protocols, and often they're tribally specific. So there may be requirements working with one nation and different ones for another one. There's also, I think, in certain regions like the Arctic, more and more gatekeeping from multiple individuals, because the old idea is that Western science could come in and simply do what they want and then leave the gift of research and extract data and so on, all of that's fundamentally being attacked, and the power relationships are changing, and that whole subject status of the Indigenous world is being unsettled in a good way, I guess. But there are power differentials there also of who gets within Indigenous communities to do the gatekeeping and who doesn't. And whether that necessarily advances knowledge. It's the agendas of the scholarly community and the agendas of community may be two different things. So for example, recently we were working on a project, and the people we were working with really wanted drones so that they could hunt caribou. And you know, we were fine with that, but many in the environmental movement wouldn't be. So you often find incontrovertibly difficult things to marry. And we're living through a very interesting time, I think, in that regard of how Western science, however defined, operates, and its relationship with Indigenous communities of all diverse sorts all over the world.
Yeah, I think what is important is that complexity of ethical debate. It's the bringing in of many diverse voices, isn't it, into that ethical debate about what is actually happening on the ground. I think that's quite important.
Well, I was thinking about this the other day in relation to, you know, the Dasgupta review and, you know, all this work about measuring natural capital and different sorts of capital. I mean, it did occur to me that so much of that work relies on who gets surveyed, you know. And again, we come back to ethics. And where is your heart in this? You know, it's a non-fashionable thing to say, but ethics walk and talk in terms of how knowledge gets produced, disseminated, and contextualized.
No, it was interesting. I mean, the question of how things are chosen as sites of study, or what's chosen as a site of study, and how those arguments are framed. You know, the Dasgupta review was an extremely interesting example of trying to push the boundaries in terms of macroeconomics, but also coming up against the boundaries of other ways of thinking about things. So it was an alternative, but it was an alternative, you know, designed by a particular set of people within a particular context. So it had strengths and weaknesses of that.
I mean, in preparing this, I kept coming back to this book, I don't know, Prosperity Without Growth by Jackson. Not that I agree with it, because I thought in many ways it was naive, but it spawned that whole question of, you know, degrowth and whether you can have prosperity if you're determined to keep growing as we conventionally understand it. And I'm not sure that we've got much further than where he was at, really. We've come to an impasse in some levels. And the fact that we are so focused on GDP and on economics as the fundamental place from which we're going to find solutions may in itself be wrong. That may be the wrong place to start. You know what I mean?
Well, that's one of the big arguments of the IGP. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
so we're
right.
into that. So that's where. But let's go on to. I'm going to come back to MJ Ascenzo's question in a minute, because that came up first. But let's just go to Beatrice Paz for the moment. So Beatrice is saying, could you please talk more about international law coverage and mega projects that endanger Indigenous lands and peoples? What is left to be done when international agreements have clauses that put them above national governments?
I think that international law is systemically not necessarily being how can I don't know, how can I put it? There are global geopolitics have played such an enormous role in whether the United States will acknowledge, for example, that its indigenous people are peoples, because peoples have status within international law. And in the last 10, 15 years, we've had this faith really that the idea of individual human rights will emancipate vast swathes of the indigenous world. And there's been an increasing drumbeat from multiple voices that hasn't worked. So on the one hand, you have amazing scholars, indigenous scholars, putting all their effort into law as a means of raising their people. But then on the other hand, you have a long history of law being used to keep disadvantage in place. I think going forward that the hope lies with the disproportionately younger indigenous populations. And you find that historically, whereas, you know, there's a long tradition of middle-class African Americans encouraging their brightest and best to study sociology. On the other hand, indigenous people in the richer North America tend to put their brightest and best through law school as a means of fighting treaties and land claims. So it may be that as we get this local two-pronged attack where you have more and more political engagement from indigenous women in particular at the level of senator and above, and then you have more and more legal attacks upon the internal edifice that encourages disadvantage, that may be ultimately more fruitful than the great hope that there was that the UN would be the solution.
Yeah. Let's go now to the lecture theatre, actually, because we have the students in the lecture theatre. And I think, Joanne, you have a question in the lecture theatre.
Hi, Joy.
Good, you're there. Good.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I think going back earlier, because I think many of our students are here today, and we teach them about research ethics, about comparative studies, which are, I think, very well manifested in your talk today. But I want to expand the research ethics here a little bit more, not only beyond the indigenous studies, because I think there are very complex power relations involved. And it's not only related to indigenous people, but for any people, for example, me, myself, I do Indian studies. For any people any scholar who does cross-cultural studies, the power relations is always so present throughout my research career. For example, on the one hand, I think we do appreciate like kind of comparative studies is always good to bring a new perspective, even to a well-studied society, not to mention those less studied. But on the other hand, we always face this question of who is doing research, by whom, for whom. And I think it is on this aspect that scholars sometimes, especially, for example, I do poverty-related studies, I go to the rural areas in India, but I'm not part of the community. And it's obvious that even though I come from a developing country myself, but still there is this kind of power hierarchies involved in that. And I think that really puts any scholar who do comparative studies, especially if you are conducting research related to less advantaged group, in a very difficult situation. So I have one friend who does the Anu indigenous group in Japan. And because of this reason, she actually quit her research after a few years because she thought that, oh, this research can establish herself in the Western world. She's originally from Singapore. So in the academic world find her good job. But in the end, she felt that what she can do for these indigenous groups are very, very little. And she always felt that kind of struggle between, on the one hand, oh, you come from an outsider, what you are doing here, your scholars are not always welcomed by these groups. But on the other hand, she is also constantly fighting for the misunderstandings of these indigenous groups in the Western world, in the world that she is living in, that she's familiar with. So I'm wondering whether you could share any experience related to indigenous studies on this kind of very challenging academic ethics.
I think that's a brilliant point, and you've really summed up something really fascinating. I mean, I think it comes down to the fact that the nature of the scholar and of scholarly endeavor has changed, certainly in my lifetime, because the tribe that I was inculcated into as a young colonial working class woman, I was told really that there was this tribe called being a scholar, and intellectual endeavor leading to wisdom was what your job was within society. And that was, you know, you had a certain role within the university, had a role, and being an academic was an identified category. But as time's gone by, and this is a good change, I guess, the role of the intellectual in society has changed, and the role of intellectual work has changed. And it's more about what you can do for communities. It's more about impact rather than knowledge and wisdom for itself as a good in itself. And rather than your community of concern being other scholars, your community of concern needs to be found, and they must find value in what you propose to do rather than you simply doing it. And you may not, you know, come in as a savior and say, hey, I happen to know this information from extracting your data. You can have it if you want. Those days are thoroughly over. But there are limits to not allowing scholars to be scholars, in the sense of allowing scholars to be discrete from communities. And it would be sad if some of the older models of scholarship were completely dispensed with. I mean, there should be a role, I think, for synergy and for cross-cultural communication. It worries me that as we retreat into polarized kind of simulacra of nation states where intellectually we cannot meet, that will have negative concerns, that could have negative implications, and that no one will be able to voice any analysis that isn't synonymous with their ethnicity.
Then we've got one question. We've just got time for one more. We'll squeeze one in because I always run out of time in the IGP, which is always a shame, but let's squeeze one more in. So there's one from Amanda Kartikasari saying, in terms of the digital revolution, do you think that technology could be used to help Indigenous communities to feel more empowered to collaborate with across communities for environmental benefits?
Technology is technology. You can use it for good or bad, can't you?
Yeah.
I think that you can see in Africa that access to mobile phones has been really transformative, especially in terms of healthcare and banking and remittances being sent across nation state boundaries and so on. I think the fundamental thing that will change life for the better for, say, Indigenous North America is for treaties to be respected. You know, that's why I have a research group called treatiedSpaces.com.
Yeah.
Because I think that fundamentally, if we could start with the treaties being respected that were struck in the first place and move on from then towards repatriation and of land and giving greater political power, that's, in my belief, the way forward.
Yeah, I think the land issue is so crucial. So I mean, I think that's fundamental to the whole thing. Well, Joy, thank you very much for lots of your patience with answering all our questions and queries, which I'm sure you've heard many times before, but we are very, very grateful to you. And I'm sorry we've run out of time, but we who are on the panel, well, sorry, those of us who you can see, we can just give you a quick round of applause. And thank you very, very much for your time and for all of your contribution today. And I hope we'll see you again soon. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.